Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Ara McCauley, and I'm the artistic director of the festival, and I'm pleased to present Words as Solace, The Joy of Reading. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the festival customarily takes place, and where I am situated this afternoon, is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its water, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd like to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to those organizations and individuals who support us. And for this event, I'd especially like to thank Profile Kingston, the media sponsor of this event, Book Clubs United, author patron of Susan Olding, and Theatre Kingston, our arts partner for this event. This event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period. Feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the event for the moderator. You'll find this button at the bottom of your screen. And there's also a raise your hand function located in the reactions. Or if you're on your phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and we can take your questions that way. As a thank you for your continuing support of Kingston Writers Fest and for joining us at the virtual edition of the festival, we will randomly select a pre-registered participant of this event following our Q&A to win a copy of Susan's book. We will do a book draw for each onstage event throughout the festival, so we encourage you to register and join us for the rest of our events. And now I am delighted to introduce the event's interviewer, Barbara Bell. Barbara is, of course, a familiar face to the festival crowd. She was at the first festival planning meeting in 2009 and was artistic director from 2014 to 2020. She's a strong believer in the importance of art and creative exploration and has sat on several committees, including as chair of the City of Kingston Arts Advisory Committee, and has also flexed her creative muscle in many ways as an actor, theatrical and film producer, television host, editor, and writer. It is no surprise to see her new career path continues to find ways to inspire creatives as a certified integral professional coach with her own practice, Tourist Life Coaching. Please welcome Barbara Bell.
Thank you so much, Ara, for that very kind introduction. Needless to say, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be back with Kingston Writers Fest. It's very special to me. Susan Olding. Her first book, Pathologies, A Life in Essays, was selected by Amazon.ca and 49th Shelf as one of 100 Canadian books to read in a lifetime. And it's also been variously described as deeply intelligent, original, nuanced, and wise. With that critical success to live up to, her second essay collection, Big Reader, does not disappoint. Demonstrating a deep respect and love for words and for books and reading, and showcasing a facility for stretching and reshaping language in unexpected ways, Susan's essays are both playful and profound, incisive and ambivalent, magically metaphorical, and touchingly vulnerable. Revered Canadian poet Lorna Crozier, herself no slouch when it comes to extraordinary play with words and meanings, says this of Big Reader: if these essays were glass bells and you struck them one by one with your favorite pen, they would ring with the purest, clearest notes, each chapter in its singularity contributing to the gorgeous orchestral music that this book is. For the Ormsby Review, Heather Graham writes, for some writers, the essay is an opportunity to turn out a neat little piece of creative nonfiction. For Olding, it is an artistic challenge and one she excels at. Her work is intricate, intimate, and an absolute pleasure to read. Hailing from Toronto, formerly a resident of Kingston and now enjoying the natural beauty of Vancouver Island, Susan is a cherished alumnus of Kingston Writers Fest. How delighted I am to welcome her back to the festival.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that exceptionally warm introduction. And it's so nice to see you again. Barbara and I work together in various capacities at the festival. And I had been a volunteer at the festival myself. And so it's lovely to see you. Thank you.
It's lovely to see you too. And I certainly do miss our, our one-to-ones. We've had so many great conversations in the past.
Yeah, indeed.
And, look forward to today's conversation, even though it's remote. So for anyone who hasn't yet had the pleasure of diving into Big Reader, we'd love it if you could just give us a taste of your language and your voice, Susan, if you just start us off with a reading.
Absolutely. I'm just going to read from the very beginning. There's sections of what are really amount to prose poems scattered throughout the book. And this is the first one. It's called Possibilities. Possible places to bring a book. Your bed, under the blankets with a flashlight, the bath, the back seat of the car if you are brave or foolish or lucky enough never to get sick on the winding roads, or smart enough to open a window against the fumes of your parents' cigarettes, smart enough to peel your eyes from the page every once in a while and watch the telephone poles flit past. Try the fork of an apple tree in May, where you can prop your feet against the facing branch and suck the scent of blossoms from your lungs to the soles of your shoes. Behind the neighbor's house, the sun will sink, staining the sky, the shade of pink at blossom's core. Petals and page gleam white and whiter in the half-light. The doctor's office, the dentist, the lunch counter at the local delicatessen, the dock, the deck, the porch, the beach. The couch in the room where everybody else watches TV, sink unseen into its green cushions, leaf through a dozen chapters to the ripples of canned laughter. The schoolroom, where you can slip your book inside the regulation reader, while your classmates sound out words like see, spot, run. Your tongue can try on catapult and luminous and ravishing and riverine. Tap the syllables against your teeth, roll them like a chocolate egg along the roof of your mouth, savor your guilty, solitary joy. Rain splatters the windowsills, radiators hiss and hum, the air reeks of mucilage and damp mittens, while forgotten, at the back of the room, you lose yourself in story and sound, where with your secret book within a book, you might be any she or he, or they, or we, or I.
Thank you so much, Susan. That's just lovely. And I love that you call them prose poems. I'm just so aware, reading your essays, of the poetic quality of so much that you write. Have you ever considered poetry as a form to explore?
Oh, more than that. I write poetry all the time. Yeah, I write and publish poetry, but I haven't published a book. I'm working on a manuscript though. So it's just a slow accretion over the years. I think poetry was my first love, and I started writing poetry. And I also think that the essay and poetry are very closely related forms, or can be for certain essayists.
Oh, do you want to say more about that?
Well, I think that, I mean, there are different types of essays, so I can't really speak to every type of essay, but personal essayists and lyric essayists typically are very concerned with metaphor, and so they also will join things associatively rather than in a linear, logical way, and so those are just two of the qualities that are, align them with poets, I think.
Mm-hmm. That associative quality, resonates throughout the book, and it's really one of the many joys of reading your essays. It's just so fun to follow your train of thought. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But I'd like to start, if you don't mind, if you would just answer this in a few words. How do you describe your readerly relationship with the written word?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, at times ravenous, at times ambivalent. Mostly though, I mean, reading is a source of tremendous pleasure and learning, education. So I don't know what I would do honestly without reading. And in fact, that might be the reason for this book. There's an essay at the core of the book, which is about, it's about a lot of things. It's about my mother's loss of sight, and it's about the way that our increased use of screens has affected us as readers in general with the rise of the internet. But it's also about my fear that I was losing reading during the period of time that I was writing these essays. Partly due to some vision problems I was having myself, and partly just due to the stresses of midlife. I was traveling a lot to see my parents who were unwell. I had multiple jobs. There were other family issues going on. And so it just felt like I wasn't reading. And it isn't true. Of course, I was reading. But because I was reading largely from screens, I didn't have that sort of pleasure of the physical object of a book in the way that I had really enjoyed it for most of my life. And that was a deep loss. So I had to explore that.
Mm-hmm. And, you investigate the science in about reading and the differences between taking the word in on a screen and taking it in via the hard object. Do you feel as though you wanted to return to the reading of the hard book, but couldn't, or?
Yes, I mean, it was almost that strong. I mean, partly because my eyesight was giving me a lot of trouble. And so I had like a number of things going on with my vision. And so I wasn't able to read at night, which was often the only time that I had time to read. And so that was part of the problem. But I eventually solved it, in part, at least with audiobooks. And now that those are my new love is audiobooks. I absolutely adore them. But I still love the actual book. And luckily my visual problems were addressed. And so I'm now able to pick up a book and read it properly the way I'd like to.
Here's another question apropos of this. How might your reading habits have changed or altered during the pandemic? Were you able to read? Did you want to read?
Oh, yes, I read avidly. But again, a lot of my reading is by audio now. So I read when I was walking, I read when I was in the garden, I read before falling asleep. I read more than ever. But I know that for some people, the strain of what was happening made that difficult. And I can absolutely identify with that because of the earlier period in my life where I too was under just enormous stress and found it very difficult to kind of connect with that with the pleasure I'd previously derived from books. So.
Mm-hmm. And where does words as solace fit into that whole picture?
Well, I think many of us during the pandemic have found that nature, I think, being in nature is really number one. People who have a spiritual practice, I think for them, that's become even more important. And people who have an artistic practice also have leaned heavily on that. But reading is another one of those activities that I think many of us have turned to with renewed vigor and dedication during this time, at least if you believe the reports of coming out of Quill and Choir and various places like that. And I hope it's true, because we all need to buy books.
Yes, right, and find what there is to be found in them in whatever form you consume them. I, for one, a huge proponent of the hard copy book. with aging eyes, I do get it, like reading late at night. Let's make sure the light is really good.
Mhm. Yeah.
But it has been a tremendous source of solace for me through the pandemic. Wow, I'm all for the big doorstopper tomes and the historical series. 6 books long, each 900 pages. I'm in.
Yeah, actually, one of my greatest delights in hearing from readers of Big Reader is that some people have turned back to some of those books that I talk about, like Middlemarch, for example, books that they may have read before or maybe didn't try before because they just look too forbidding, and they've actually read or reread those books. That's a real thrill to know that I've encouraged people to turn back to those. So.
Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, many books that you've referenced, Anna Karenina as one of them, and Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. My goodness, those are not insubstantial in any way.
No, they were getting paid by the word in those days. Bring those days back, I say.
Yeah, right. Let's start a petition.
Yeah.
So let's turn to the essay, A Pilgrimage to Hampstead, or Household Pets of the Greater and Lesser Poets. What a sweet title that is. It describes a seemingly universal penchant for avid readers to become kind of obsessive about their favorite author, to, for instance, visit historical residences or birthplaces of the great writers. And you write of your own pilgrimage to Wentworth House, in which the great romantic poet John Keats, who was your particular literary infatuation at that time, had lived before his tragically early death. It seems as though some of the small items that furnished the place pointed in some way to the tribulations the writer was experiencing, and tribulations that perhaps you felt or shared in some part.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these houses are filled with relics, and it's not really clear sometimes whether they're genuine. And in this case, in fact, a lot of the objects in the house really weren't there in Keats's time. But there were things that did belong to him in some way. But I think I was more moved by the presence of this cat sleeping on his bed, or what was said to be his bed. I assume it was a bed from the same period at any rate, because it was very short, and we don't have such short beds anymore. So yeah, it's really interesting to go to these houses. I've been to lots of other ones too. I've been to Dickens' house, in fact, as well, and that one is very interesting as well. It's also in London, and there are some in Canada. So it's worth checking them out if you're in a town where there's an author has lived, and see, is there a museum? Is there a house that you can visit?
There's one not that far from Kingston, and that would be Al Purdy's A-Frame.
Exactly.
And Margaret Lawrence's house, which is just outside of Peterborough, I believe. Yeah, so it's a great invitation for people to explore that whenever they start to go visiting again. You write in this essay along these lines, then, walking slowly from room to room, I thought I glimpsed him, or maybe it was his shadow. How do you want to describe what this sort of sensing of him was, in some way, what you call a mystical communion with the poet?
Try and sort of put myself back to the time. I think when we go to these houses, sometimes they really are pilgrimages, in the sense that we're looking to fill some emotional gap within us. And in this case, I was struggling with infertility, and so it was a period of grief and loss. And I was reflecting on the many much more serious losses that Keats himself had endured during the time that he lived in that house, from the death of his brother to the departure of another brother to America, and eventually to his own illness, and he recognized his impending death while he was living there. So reflecting on all of that, I guess I felt a bit companioned in my own grief, and that is a kind of amazing. That's probably why I use the word mystical experience. It just allowed me to keep going along that path with a little more, a little comforted, solaced, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that you, with the right receptors, with the right mindset in place, that is entirely possible. I mean, I think it is what we're looking for when we go to the home of a resident, of a writer that we revere. You wrote in an earlier essay, it is by imagining the humanity of our favorite authors that we stand the greatest chance of gaining insight into them and their work. It is by imagining the humanity of our favorite authors that we come to better understand ourselves. Is that the kind of sense that you got in being in that space, in that time?
I'm not sure it was so much in the space and time, but it was through the reading of, in particular, of his letters, where you get a very rich sense of the personality behind the maybe somewhat intimidating or forbidding to our contemporary eyes and ears poetry. So, I mean, in the letters, he is a young man full of gusto for life, and full of all a young man's, flaws, and also he's kind of genius, right? So he's a lot of fun. He is so funny in those letters. If people would read the letters, they would, I think, gain a very different impression of him. So yeah, I think that's where I learned more about his foibles and his personality quirks, and I would encourage anyone to go and read those letters if you are looking for, well, it's just a rollicking fun read. You'll also learn a ton about the slang of the period. So there are a lot of words that you can figure out the meaning from the context, but you also get all the literary gossip of the day. So
that's fun. And I think there were actual examples of his writing in the house, were there not?
Yes, there were. I guess there were bits and pieces of work there. Yeah.
Just before we leave this essay, I just wanted to touch on the cat, as you mentioned, the live cat. But sometimes there are dead cats in authors' homes. Talk about that a little.
Well, apparently in Petrarch's house, there was a dead cat, a mummified cat. And then, of course, Ernest Hemingway's house is famous for its cats that supposedly never actually lived with him. He didn't actually have one there. So, but now people are, it's supposedly the great thing that he had all these cats. So who knows?
So they go expecting to see the cat.
That's right. Yeah.
And then when they go to Petrarch's house, even way back then in the 14th and 15th centuries, people were expecting to see the mummified cat.
Yes. Yeah.
You also mentioned another slightly macabre thing, which was the habit of taking postmortem photos of departed loved ones, and that you're trying to recreate this sight line that you imagine in your memory of a photo of Keats in that room looking out the window. So you want to tell us about that moment?
Yeah, that was actually a painting that his friend Severn did of him purportedly in that room, but it was painted after Keats died, and so it wasn't from life. But they had placed the chairs in the room as if in the same position that he would have sat in if that painting were actually a photographic representation of something that actually happened, which it may or may not. He may or may not have ever sat that way. We'll never know.
No, that's true. And that's actually what I'd call some artistic license, which is a little different than posing your deceased relative. As you know, that became quite a habit in the Victorian period. But I'm sort of relieved to hear you say it's actually a painting and not a post. So, you know, I won't say you make light of it, but you're maybe slightly disparaging about the fact that you were so obsessed with Keats. Maybe embarrassed might be.
Yeah.
But isn't there something really rather exhilarating or freeing or maybe even critical in succumbing to that kind of intense focus?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, it's a while ago now, so I'm no longer as obsessed with Keats as I was for a brief period of my life. But I mean, I think that it makes a difference that I had memorized many of the poems and could hear them in my head all the time when I was going about my own business. And so the rhythms of the language and the musicality of the language was, you know, I was sort of I don't know, holding it or carrying that within me. And that's an amazing gift. And I don't think you can get that without a really deep immersion in a writer's work. As I said, I was more, the letters always appealed to me more than the poetry itself, even. Maybe that's a bit embarrassing to say, but it's true. And so I really, though, do feel that it gave me just a lovely entree to another time, another place, and an escape from some of the difficulties that I was enduring myself. So I think that can be true for anyone who gets really sort of attached to a writer and a writer's work.
I think that's a really nice positive way of putting it. And I'm curious whether that kind of habit persists with you. Is there someone that you're really, really resonating with and focusing on now?
Well, I not to the same degree, I wouldn't say, which maybe reflects a bit on the fact that I'm probably in a better place in my life than I was then emotionally. But I've been reading a lot of Ali Smith lately and just really enjoying the wordplay and the puns, but also there was in the quartet that she recently wrote, there was a depth of feeling. And I think it was really wonderful to be able to read the books. I actually read them all at once rather than reading them as they came out. She's a very cerebral kind of writer. So I was surprised at the degree to which I was moved by the whole thing. And I think that reading all of them together helped to sort of exaggerate that effect or create that effect in a deeper way.
And depending on, I'm presuming from the titles and the fact that it was a very systematic series of books, that she had an intention that there was a through line, that they maybe were meant to be read together ultimately.
Oh, absolutely. But I also think that they were an interesting experiment because they were written kind of on the fly and she didn't know what was. So I think she had, this is as a writer, sort of from a process point of view, it's really interesting to think about this. Yes, she had some kind of a plan, but it was a loose plan because she didn't know what was going to happen and what she would want to incorporate. And it was very clear that she was writing a bunch of books that had to do with the present moment. So, yeah, I'd love to learn more about how she managed to make that work. And it was quite exciting, actually.
I think just the whole idea of having a plan, but leaving it loose is sort of a good prescription for everyday life because we simply don't know what's coming. And so,
Sure. We sure learned that in the last few years.
Yeah, how to be flexible. That's I mean, I think it is a little nugget of wisdom to carry forward in our own lives, whether we're writers or not. Okay, so is it all right with you if we move on to a rake's progress? Sure. Okay. In his Toronto Star review of Big Reader, Stephen Beattie writes, Olding is a master at extended riffs on a subject, taking a particular theme, like libraries or the nature of artistic self-doubt, and extending it in interesting and unexpected directions. And I think this holds true for the composition of each of your essays. they digress, they coalesce, you just follow all of these different streams of inquiry, and sometimes it's scientific, and sometimes it's historical, and sometimes it's conjectural, but sometimes you're just playing. And that was the sense I got from reading this particular essay, that there's a real element of play.
Well, thank you. Yes, I think there is, because I was absolutely playing with the different meanings of the word rake and just trying to make connections between them. The essay was originally written on the invitation of a couple of editors who were trying to put together an anthology of creative nonfiction, Canadian creative nonfiction, for use in classrooms, university classrooms and elsewhere. And because there wasn't at the time such an anthology of specifically CNF, and they asked in particular for a lyric essay because they didn't have any other samples of that. They had lots of samples of the other subgenres of creative nonfiction, but they were looking for something that was a little more like this. And so I said, that sounds like fun. I'll see if I can do it. And this is when I was living in Kingston, and we lived on Gore Street, and we had a ton of maple trees, some of the old trees there, and they were losing their leaves like crazy. And I just started with what was happening in my life at that moment, and I was raking leaves. And so there it was. And I'd for a long time been really interested in Hogarth's art, but I hadn't really thought of it for a while. I think I'd had that was an earlier fascination that I hadn't thought of for years, and somehow I made the connection, and I went back to look at those pieces, the Rake's Progress, and then, a whole lot of other connections kind of found their way into the piece.
And so your mind needs to be in a certain sort of state of receptivity to whatever's going to come your way. Can you describe that as a writer, what it's like when you're allowing that, one thing leaping to the next?
I think it was Keats who said we need to be patient as the flower waiting the bee, something like that. It is a state of total receptivity, and it's part of what he meant by negative capability, actually, is that sort of openness to experience. It's hard to describe it. Maybe it's a little easier to talk about when it occurs. It's definitely not when you're trying to make it happen. So I think it's, for me, often I'll experience that when I'm out for a walk, when I'm in nature, when I'm in the garden, when I'm having a shower. Often movement is part of it for me. A walk is part of my writing practice, a very conscious part of my writing practice. And so if I'm stuck, or if I just don't have ideas or whatever, I have to get up and move, and that's what I do.
So kinesthetic in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And do you feel like it just sort of allows you into that other part of your brain that is not judging? It's expansive. It's open to association.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think for people who practice other art forms like visual art, for example, and maybe drama to some degree in a slightly different way, any kind of collaborative work, you're kind of sparking off other people. And so that gives you that gives you a kind of energy. With visual art, I think, you're using another part of your brain to do the actual creation. And so your mind can sort of wander freely. Music, that's similar, but writers are kind of at a disadvantage in that way, because we need the logical parts of our mind in order to do the work, but they also can interfere with the work. And depending on the type of writer you are, and whether you're a person who edits heavily, who second guesses yourself a lot, is plagued by self-doubt, which I am, then that editor is working too hard most of the time. So you want to try to find ways to, let the editor take a rest and
reassure that editor that for now, nothing's required.
That's right.
And
I don't need you now.
yeah, I don't.
Go away.
Please just go sit in a corner for a little bit.
Yeah.
And really inviting that that other part of the brain to do its thing. And you know, if you can access that in a kinesthetic way by walking, moving around, paying attention to other things, that really helps open that pathway, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So just returning to the actual engravings, what do you find in revisiting them for the writing of this essay, which I understand now has been a few years since you wrote it, but can you just share what you found most striking about the richness of detail you mentioned?
Oh, yeah, they're extraordinary, really. And I think in my first acquaintance with them, I had noticed the humor and and I guess the social critique in those engravings, but I hadn't seen the interconnections because I hadn't paid attention to them as a whole. And what I liked about looking at them was it just made me feel how it made me feel like it was similar to what we were saying about Ali Smith's work. I think here was someone who had a plan, a sort of overall plan, but he probably didn't know exactly what he was going to do in each piece before he created them, but he found ways for them to, they're intertextual. They refer back to one another in very interesting ways. And they're funny as well. So he's known as the father of sequential art. So any comics artist should definitely take a look at Hogarth's work. It's worth the look.
Yeah, you quoted Charles Lamb, who says, other pictures we look at, his prints we read.
Yeah.
And that they need to be in a specific order in order to actually follow the narrative of Tom Brakel's very sad downfall.
Yes.
It's sad, but as you say, with all of the visual puns, it does remind me of Dickens. It's that sort of combination of this social commentary on terrible things, and yet this ability to bring lightness with in Hogarth's case, a visual pun or something humorous about his presentation of this fellow in these dire circumstances. Yeah, so I got nerded out when reading this essay, and I found this really neat essay from 1939 that explains that Hogarth was actually an intimate of the great writers of the time, and that his work is replete with as many references to their work as their work is packed with references to his art. Is that something that you noticed? And is that something you do yourself?
I probably did notice it at the time or knew it because a lot of the sort of background information about Hogarth that I draw on in that essay comes from an absolutely wonderful biography of him by Jenny Uglow. It's really a terrific biography, and terrific in the sense that she's very good on both his life and his art, which doesn't always happen. So yes, I mean, I knew that he was connected with writers, and of course, his whole his pursuance of copyright was of direct relevance to writers, at least down the line. Initially, it wasn't relevant to writers, but eventually became so. Is it something I do myself? You mean draw from visual artists? And not consciously, but I do love visual art, and I do enjoy, I'm an appreciator, and I guess I should say too that I'm absolutely not a visual artist myself, and have no skills or talent in that department, although I drew as a kid, as many people do. But I recently took a visual art course called Mapping as Art, and that was part of I'm doing some research at Queen's and hoping to make some kind of an installation. So despite my lack of ability, I'm going to be trying to do that. And so I was engaged in that, and it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, that's very cool. And, it just seems to me if you can just tell the editor to go in the corner and not worry about how well you're doing it and allow the other part of the brain to go, okay, let's riff on this. What can I do next? And just have fun with it. I'm sure you're going to put something really wonderful together.
Well, I was at Helen Humphrey's talk yesterday morning about her beautiful new book, and she said something that I think is so true. She said there's something really wonderful in being a beginner. And she was talking about her own visual art practice. She does a lot of nature drawings, and I agree with that completely. I think if we can put ourselves into that place, it's very freeing and leads to all kinds of wonderful things in the art form that we're maybe more familiar with.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about the confidence, the self-assurance with which small children make art, there is no critical voice there. They are just completely into that creative part of their brain and enjoying the experience. And you yourself said you drew when you were younger, and before that, self-assessment kicked in and you start making comparisons or that kind of thing. We all have it. I firmly believe that we all have that. And if we can just be like a child, have a beginner's mind, as Helen said, I think there's every possibility of coming up with something really cool and unique. So go for it. I'd like to move on now, just watching the time here. Would you like to just read us a little piece from the essay Unruly Pupil?
Sure. Yeah, this piece, this essay comes about 3/4 of the way through the book. And it's actually an essay about essays. So it's kind of, meta, but this part, maybe not so much. This is the beginning of the piece. Unruly Pupil. In my second year of university, I took a job at an independently owned bookstore. The place was called Reader's Den, but there was nothing den-like about it. No mahogany, no oak, no crimson curtains, no whisper of sweet tobacco, no leather club chairs, no chairs of any description. Instead, it boasted bright track lights, row upon row of cheap white melamine shelves, a long newsstand continually in need of restocking, and an enormous floor-to-ceiling plate glass window that jutted on an angle to the southwest. The window overlooked busy Bloor Street. Across the road loomed the Royal Conservatory of Music, and beside it, Philosopher's Walk, a curving pathway to the campus, shaded by horse chestnuts and maples. From the raised dais behind the cache, I could see the walk's wrought iron gates and the leaves on the old trees, lime green in spring, darker in the summer rains. I could see people come and go from the nearby shops and pubs and doctors' offices, mothers tugging their children's hands, lovers licking each other's ice cream cones, tourists consulting their maps. I liked this vantage point, high enough to offer prospect, yet close enough to yield details. It gave me license to stare. Once in early June, I was standing at the cache, gazing out that window, watching the white candles of the chestnuts blow themselves out on the ground, when I heard a familiar voice. "You brat." It was my 11th grade English teacher, Miss Abels. She lived nearby. I knew because once she had taken my entire class to a performance of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Afterwards, we'd gone back to her ground floor flat for coffee. Perched on her low couches, and crowded cross-legged on her Killeen carpet. We'd analyzed the play while gawking at her high Victorian ceiling, her framed theatrical posters, her plants, her bentwood rocker, the objects on her fireplace mantel, the fireplace mantel itself, everything carefully chosen, everything deliberately arranged, everything advertising a woman of independence, and all of it evidence of an urban sophistication that none of us possessed and most of us envied. Finally, she led us all back to the subway and from there to the commuter train that would take us home to the suburbs, the slumbering, insipid suburbs. Now she looked me up and down. "What are you doing here?" she said. We talked. I told her what I was studying and when I expected to graduate. She raised an eyebrow as if to say that prognostications were all very well, but she'd save her praise for when she saw the proof. Then she paid for her magazine and walked out into the late spring afternoon, her long dark hair rippling in the breeze as she disappeared into the crowd. The brat remark stung. I thought I'd been a good student in that English class. Good in comparison to how I'd been in most of my other classes, that is. At least I'd done the reading. At least I'd participated in discussions. But it seemed Ms. Abel saw things differently, or else my actual performance had left a less lasting impression than my general reputation. I'd been wayward, willful, irresponsible, and often truant as a teen. I was still most of those things.
Wonderful. Thanks, Susan. In this essay, you describe the unnamed shelf where all the books that couldn't be easily categorized lived, and you were drawn to read from that shelf because of a particular customer in the store. Do you want to tell us who he was and what led you there and what you discovered when you got there?
Yes, well, he was, I mean, bookstores, as you know, are places where you get all types of people coming in. And that's actually one of the wonderful things about working in a bookstore. You really see people from all walks and levels of society. And this particular customer, I call him a Czech emigre. I really don't know. He was Eastern European, but I don't know, actually, I was too ignorant to know what country he was really from. And I don't even know, there were times when I wondered if he was an unhomed person later on in the year. He was kind of down on his luck at any rate, but he tried, he tried really hard. He always came in with he had a blue cap and he had and he always was in blue trousers and he had for a while a blue jacket. So, and he was a real reader. And he used to frequent that section, that unnamed little middle of the store section, and came away with interesting things. And so I followed him there. He was interesting to chat with. I was often on servicing the cash. And so he'd come up and talk about what he was reading, or I'd see what he was reading. And I thought, that looks interesting. I'm going to try it out.
Great. Yeah, so you describe in great detail all the different topics that can be covered. What would you call that shelf today? Have you got a sort of sense of how it should be labeled?
Well, I mean, I think they, actually, we still don't really see it in bookstores very often. There's rarely an essays section, but that's essentially what this was. So there was, on one side of this was a freestanding shelf. So on one side was poetry, on the other side were these prose books that were unclassifiable, and they really were collections of essays, is what they were on the whole. There were sometimes there were other bits of unclassifiable things in there with them, but yeah.
Bookstores are all about sort of, categorization. And I know that there's always a struggle in a bookstore if a book comes in and it kind of crosses genre.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, do we put this in historical romance, or do we put this in romance, or do we put this in just general fiction? don't know what to do, big panic.
Well, it's hard to sell. And, I mean, I understand the problem. It's as a former bookseller, I get it. But it's, people want to know what's it about. And with a collection of any kind, it's not there. It's about many things. And it's also about more than those many things individually. It's about the sum of their parts. But that can be hard to articulate in a way that makes it easy to sell.
Absolutely. We're keen to get questions from the audience, so please put them into the Q&A box if you would, and I'll just start checking while Susan and I continue to chat. You quote David Foster Wallace that the essay is basically an enormous eyeball floating around something, reporting what it sees. Tell us what you believe about the essay form.
Well, I write them a lot, so obviously I love them. What I believe is that it's such a capacious form. You can do so much with it. I mean, I quote a lot of different essayists in this essay in my section headings, and each of those section headings is a quote by one or another essayist about what he or she thinks the essay is or has called the essay. So, Johnson famously wrote that it's a loose Sally. So it's like a baggy, formless thing. But I think I and other essayists have showed that it can be a very formally constructed thing as well. And that's a really interesting paradox. It can be either or, it can be both. And there's room to talk about just about anything. In terms of content, you can write about anything you want in an essay, and it can be personal or less personal. It can be funny, it can be argumentative, it can be poignant, it can tell a story, it can do so much. So that's one of the reasons I love it.
What for you are the kind of non-negotiable elements of an essay to be a successful essay?
I'm not sure if I have any. It has to work. It has to work. I don't know if anything's non-negotiable. I mean, I think that most essayists have to be, it isn't non-negotiable, but the essays that I tend to enjoy are the ones that are quite exploratory or reflective. The ones where I really get a sense that the writer has a question that that they're pursuing, and they really are trying to think on the page. The most successful essayists, I think, are people who think on the page, and the very best essayists are the ones, I think, who think and feel on the page and sort of invite the reader into the process somehow so that the reader does the same. So, I mean, my ultimate goal as an essayist is to create that sensation somehow in the reader so that they're thinking new thoughts and feeling new feelings all at the same time. That's sort of the goal.
Oh, lovely. I love that. And what I'm hearing is that, there's an element of curiosity that is needed in order for it to be successful, so that if you go in with a sort of pedantic set of, this is what I want to convey, perhaps it might not be as engaging on either the intellectual or the emotional planes.
Yeah, I mean, it might be an op-ed, it might be a successful argumentative essay, but it won't be the kind of essay that we're talking about here. It won't be a personal or a lyric essay. So,
we do have a lovely question from Doriana. Besides Ali Smith, which other current writers have you enjoyed reading lately?
Oh, okay. So I'm actually I just started Maggie Nelson's new book. I don't know if I'll enjoy it or not, but I just began it. And I love so many writers. I'm just going to actually, just give me a sec here. I'm going to pull up this is always a tough question. And because if you read a lot, you lose track of what you've been reading, right? So, Oh, I just finished Miriam Tave's new book, which was very enjoyable.
Mhm.
And yeah, let me do that. And I have been reading a fair bit of nonfiction as well, not essays so much as Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, is really a wonderful book about the forestry industry and about saving old growth in BC and in Canada in general. So, yeah.
Thanks, Susan. I think it might be nice if you'd give us just another little smattering of your reading. And do you have a little passage that you'd like to share from the final essay, White Matter?
Sure. Sure, this one takes us back to Dickens. Leaving the cottage, the girl pushes the screen door as far as it will go, just to be sure that it will spring back with a satisfying smack. She does not look behind her, does not turn to see her mother's frown or the embittered twist of her gingham tea towel. She does not look because it serves her mother right. Get out, quit lying around for God's sake. Put away that book and go. The ground, knotted with pine roots and slippery with their needles, slopes toward a narrow estuary. Down there, on the floating dock, the girl's little brother pokes in the brackish water with a net, looking for eels. If he catches any, her father will cook them on the hibachi for supper. She shudders. It's not that she's squeamish. Spiders, ants, wasps, mice, land snakes, tadpoles, toads, even the pickled brains in the lab where her father works. These she can look on with composure and even curiosity. But the thought of touching a live eel or any creature composed of slime sickens her. She turns from the water and heads for the fields, tucking up the hem of her skirt. A maxi sewn for a project in home economics class. It's a swath of white cotton with an elastic waistband and a wide eyelet ruffle at its bottom. Years from now, she'll reject this style for its tendency to make grown women look like little girls. But now she's convinced that her ground sweeping skirt transforms her into someone taller and older than her 12 years. And that is why she wears it as often as she can, even though she hates the way it trips her up when she walks. I'll just leave it there for now, I think.
I'm glad that you shared some of the passages of this young girl and her just sort of initial sort of self-understanding as a woman. It's very sweet, and yet here she is reading Dickens, where there's violence towards women like nobody's business. We do have two lovely questions coming in. The first one is from Joanne. Place fascinates me. Do you find your writing or process has changed since you moved from Kingston to Victoria?
That's a wonderful question. I guess the answer is yes and no. And it's a little bit hard to answer whether it's a question about like whether that's to do with the place itself, or whether it's to do with the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, right? So because we moved here just as the restrictions came into effect. So my experience of the place has been very much influenced by the fact that I came here when I did. But I mean, I think common to my writing practice in both places was walking. I religiously walked along the lakefront in Kingston, and I would be out there every day, even in the -40 days. And and I had my big puffer coat and my boots and the rest, and I'd be out there. And it's pretty much the same here. If I don't get my walk in, I'm taking it at 10 o'clock at night, and it's really important to me. It's very grounding, and just allows me to write somehow. I don't know. It's very, as Barbara said earlier, it's a kinesthetic process, I think, for me. So
Thanks, Susan. There's just one more minute left, and we're going to sneak in one question here from Ingrid. Do you find solace in writing as well as reading?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's often difficult. It's not always an easy solace. Can be confusing, can be, you can feel stuck and full of self-doubt, but there's nothing that feels better than writing something and feeling that you've expressed something the way that you really wanted to. It's the best feeling in the world.
That's perfect and lovely, and perfect note to end up on, because that's exactly what you do in this collection. Big reader. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Susan. This has just been so delightful.
Thank you, Barbara.
Keep talking for hours.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming, and to Kingston Writers Fest for having me. I so appreciate it.
Just want to pop up. I want to first of all thank our event sponsor again today, and that is Profile Kingston, which you can see featuring a lot of fantastic authors on their cover this month. Or in this slide. Again, I would like to thank Barbara and Susan for this beautiful conversation. Always lovely to see you both. And I also want to congratulate the winner of Susan's Big Reader Essays, and that is Linda Johnson. If you didn't win a copy, but you would like to get your own copy, you can do so at our official bookseller, Novel Idea Books. There are copies available to purchase in-store, by phone, or online. If you're joining us from outside of KFL-LNA, please consider supporting the authors and at your local independent bookstore. So thank you again for joining us and supporting Kingston Writers Fest. Be sure to check out kingstonwritersfest.ca for the rest of the great lineup. We have fabulous programming going through 9:30 tonight and then all day tomorrow as well. So once again, thank you, everyone.